The bank manager's face drained of color. One moment, he was smiling politely, the way bank employees smile at customers they expect to dismiss quickly. The next moment, his hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the counter just to stay upright. He looked at his computer screen, then at me, then back at the screen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with trembling fingers, put them back on, and stared at the screen again, as if hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. "Ma'am," he finally said, and his voice cracked like glass breaking. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me right now. Please don't ask questions. Just come with me immediately." Two security guards materialized from a side door, walking with purpose toward the counter. Every single person in that bank turned to look at me. My heart stopped beating. My legs went weak beneath me, and I gripped the counter to keep myself from collapsing onto the polished marble floor. All I had done was hand him my father's old bank card. A card so worn that the numbers on the front had nearly faded into nothing. A card with a magnetic strip so scratched it looked like it had survived a war. I had found it the night before, at 2 a.m, sitting on a stained motel bedspread, desperately searching through my belongings for anything I could sell for food money. I thought maybe there would be $50 on it. Maybe $100 if I was incredibly lucky. My father had been a maintenance man at a small apartment building for 31 years. He spent his days unclogging toilets and replacing light bulbs for tenants who barely knew his name. He died 19 years ago with barely enough money for a pine casket and a gravestone that only displayed his name and dates. But the number on that computer screen, the number that made this veteran banker's hands shake and his weathered face go completely white, was about to shatter everything I thought I understood about my life. Everything I believed about my father, everything I assumed about my husband, and everything I thought I had lost forever when I was thrown out of my own home with nothing but a suitcase and $53 to my name. What I'm about to share with you is a story that spans decades of secrets, betrayal that cuts deeper than any knife, and a father's love so profound that it reached beyond the grave to save his daughter at her darkest hour. By the end of this video, you will understand why some secrets are kept not out of shame, but out of the purest form of protection imaginable. You will witness how a man who appeared to have nothing actually possessed everything that mattered. 3 days before I walked through those bank doors, I had been standing on the sidewalk in front of what used to be my home. A beautiful colonial house with white shutters and a garden I had planted with my own hands over 2 decades. My husband of 22 years, a man named Gerald, who I had loved and supported through every struggle and every success, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest. Behind him, clearly visible through the window I used to look out of every morning, stood another woman. Her name was Patricia, and she had been his business partner for 3 years. She had sat at my dinner table, complimented my cooking, called me a saint for putting up with Gerald's long work hours. The entire time, she had been waiting for me to disappear, and now she was already hanging new curtains in my living room, erasing every trace of my existence from the home I had built. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Eleanor Morrow, though most people have always called me Ellie. For 22 years, I believed with every fiber of my being that I was building a life with a man who genuinely loved me. I met Gerald when I was 32 years old, working as a high school English teacher in a small town where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. He walked into my life like a thunderstorm, charming and ambitious, and so confident that he made everyone around him feel like they were part of something important. He told me he wanted to build an empire, and he wanted me by his side when he did it. He made me feel like I was the only woman in the entire world who mattered. So I quit my teaching job. I gave up the career I had spent years building, the students I loved, the independence I had worked so hard to achieve. I became his unpaid assistant, his hostess, his personal accountant, his biggest cheerleader. I organized dinner parties for clients whose names I could barely remember. I entertained business partners and their wives, smiling until my face ached at people I would never have chosen to spend time with. I proofread contracts at midnight while Gerald slept soundly beside me, never once acknowledging the work I put in. I learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny because Gerald said it was important for business. I learned to bite my tongue when men talked over me because Gerald said I needed to be more agreeable. I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating because Gerald convinced me that his success was our success, and our success required sacrifice. When we discovered we couldn't have children, when doctor after doctor delivered the same heartbreaking news, Gerald held my hand and told me it was fine. He said I was enough for him. He said we would build a different kind of legacy together. And because I wanted so desperately to believe him, I did. For 2 full decades, I poured everything I had into that man and that marriage. I gave him my youth, my energy, my dreams, my identity. I watched him grow wealthy while I grew invisible. I watched him collect accolades and achievements while I collected dust in the background of his life. And on a Tuesday afternoon in September, with the autumn leaves just beginning to turn gold on the trees I had planted in our front yard, Gerald stood in the doorway of the home I had transformed into a sanctuary and told me to leave. His voice was cold and businesslike, stripped of any emotion, as if he were dismissing an employee who had outlived their usefulness. He reminded me that the house was in his name, the cars were in his name, the bank accounts, the investments, the retirement funds, everything was in his name. I had signed a prenuptial agreement 22 years ago, back when I was young and trusting, and believed that love would protect me from ever needing legal protection. I stood on that sidewalk, my suitcase at my feet, and begged him to reconsider. I reminded him that I had nowhere to go. I had no money of my own, no career to fall back on, no family who would take me in. I had given up everything for him, and now I was being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. Gerald checked his watch, a Rolex I had given him for our 20th anniversary, and informed me that he and Patricia had dinner reservations at 7. He needed me off the property before then. Patricia Devane, his business partner, the woman who had sat across from me at Christmas dinners for 3 years, complimenting my cooking and asking about my garden with what I thought was genuine interest. She had called me a saint for putting up with Gerald's long work hours, for understanding his dedication to the company, for being so supportive while he built his empire. The entire time, she had been sleeping with my husband. The entire time, she had been waiting patiently for me to disappear from the picture. Patricia appeared in the doorway beside Gerald, wrapping her arm around his waist, with the casual possessiveness of someone who had already won. She looked at me with an expression of practiced sympathy, the kind of expression you might give a stray dog you have no intention of helping. She told me she knew this was hard, but sometimes people just grow apart. She said she was sure I would find my footing eventually. She called me a survivor, as if being forced to survive was some kind of compliment rather than the cruelest form of abandonment. I wanted to scream at both of them. I wanted to throw something through the window of the home I had decorated with my own hands. I wanted to list every sacrifice I had made, every dream I had abandoned, every piece of myself I had given away to build his life while neglecting my own. But I was so tired. 22 years of tired. 22 years of making myself small so Gerald could feel big. I picked up my suitcase and walked away down the sidewalk, the wheels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. Behind me, I heard the door close. Through the window, I could already see Patricia rearranging the furniture, erasing every trace of my existence from the home I had built. I walked away with one suitcase containing whatever clothes I could grab in the 30 minutes Gerald had given me to pack. I had $53 in my wallet, money I had saved from the grocery budget over several months, without Gerald knowing. I had the clothes on my back, and a humiliation so deep and so complete that I could barely remember how to breathe. At 58 years old, after 22 years of marriage, I was homeless, penniless, and utterly alone in the world. I found a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where you pay by the week, and learn very quickly not to look too closely at the carpet stains or the suspicious marks on the bathroom walls. The Pine Rest Motel had a flickering neon sign that buzzed like an angry wasp and a parking lot filled with cars that looked like they had seen better decades. The woman at the front desk didn't ask any questions when I paid in cash. She just handed me a key attached to a large plastic diamond and pointed down the hallway toward room 112. My room cost $175 a week, which meant that after I paid for the first week, I had exactly $53 left to my name. $53 to eat, $53 to survive, $53 to somehow figure out what came next in a life that had completely fallen apart. The room itself was exactly what you would expect for the price. A lumpy bed with a faded floral bedspread that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and industrial detergent. A water-stained ceiling with cracks that spread across the plaster like veins. A small bathroom with a faucet that dripped constantly, no matter how hard I twisted the handle. The air conditioner rattled and wheezed, but barely produced any cool air. The walls were so thin I could hear every argument in every neighboring room, every television turned up too loud, every baby crying in the middle of the night. I sat on the edge of that bed, still wearing the clothes I had been wearing when Gerald threw me out, and tried to comprehend how my life had led me to this moment. I was 58 years old. I hadn't held a real job in over 2 decades. I had no references, no recent experience, no professional connections that didn't run through Gerald. My sister Helen and I hadn't spoken in 12 years. Not since our father's funeral, when she had called him a pathetic failure, and I had told her to never contact me again. Our father had worked as a maintenance man his entire adult life, and Helen had always been ashamed of him. She had married wealthy and moved to the other side of the country, and she never missed an opportunity to remind me that I had chosen poorly by staying close to a man who fixed toilets for a living. Now here I was, lying on a stained motel bedspread, staring at a water-damaged ceiling, and I couldn't help but wonder if Helen had been right all along. That first night in the motel, I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there watching the ceiling, listening to the couple in the next room argue about money, listening to a baby cry somewhere down the hall, wondering how I had gotten here, wondering if I had ever really known my husband at all, wondering if there was any possible way forward from the complete destruction of everything I had believed my life to be. By the third night in that motel room, I was getting desperate in ways I had never experienced before in my life. I had been surviving on peanut butter eaten straight from the jar and stale crackers I bought from a gas station 3 blocks away. I rationed everything, eating just enough to keep the hunger pains at bay, but never enough to actually feel satisfied. I applied for 6 different jobs online, using the motel's unreliable Wi-Fi connection, positions that I was probably overqualified for and simultaneously underqualified for because I had no recent work experience to show. Cashier positions at grocery stores, receptionist jobs at dental offices, even a cleaning position at a local hotel. I heard nothing back from any of them. At 58 years old, with a 22-year gap in my employment history, I was apparently invisible to the job market. The world had moved on without me, while I was busy building Gerald's empire, and now I had nothing to show for any of it. At 2 a.m. on that third night, sleep refused to come once again. I had been lying in the darkness for hours, listening to the drip of the bathroom faucet and the distant sound of traffic on the highway, my mind racing through scenarios that all ended the same way. In desperation, I decided to do something I had been avoiding since I arrived at this motel. I sat down on the worn carpet next to my open suitcase and began going through its contents piece by piece, searching for anything I might have forgotten in my rush to pack, anything I could potentially sell, a piece of jewelry that might have gotten tangled up in my clothing, a watch I had overlooked, something, anything that could buy me a few more days of survival while I figured out my next move. My hands moved through blouses and sweaters, through pants and undergarments, through all the remnants of a life that had been reduced to a single suitcase. That's when my fingers brushed against the fabric of an old winter coat I hadn't worn in nearly 2 decades. It was a dark wool coat, heavy and outdated, the kind of coat that had been fashionable when I was younger, but now looked like something from another era entirely. I had grabbed it almost by accident when I was packing, mostly because it was hanging near the front of my closet and I wasn't thinking clearly. As my fingers moved across the lining, I felt something stiff tucked into an interior pocket I had forgotten even existed. My heart began to beat faster as I reached inside and pulled out a yellowed envelope that looked like it had been waiting there for years. The paper was aged and fragile, the kind of yellow that comes from decades of sitting undisturbed in darkness. But it was the handwriting on the front that made my breath catch in my throat and my hands begin to tremble uncontrollably. I recognized that handwriting immediately. It was careful and old-fashioned, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a different era and never updated his style. The words on the front of the envelope read simply, "For my Eleanor. When the world gets hard. My father, Henry Arthur Morrow, the man who had raised me and my sister Helen in a tiny apartment above a hardware store. The man who had worked as a building superintendent for 31 years, spending his days fixing leaky faucets and replacing burnt-out light bulbs and unclogging toilets for tenants who could barely afford their rent and rarely bothered to thank him. He had died 19 years ago, when I was 39 years old, and still believed that my marriage to Gerald would last forever. He died in the same small apartment he had lived in for most of his adult life, surrounded by nothing valuable except the love of his daughters and the respect of the tenants he had served so faithfully for so many years. My father never had money. Not once in my entire childhood can I remember a time when he wasn't worried about bills or stretching his paycheck to cover one more unexpected expense. He wore the same 4 shirts on rotation until the collars frayed and the elbows wore thin, and then he would patch them himself rather than buy new ones. He walked 3 miles to work every single day, rain or shine, summer heat or winter snow, because he said bus fare was wasteful and that money could be better spent on his daughters. When my mother died of cancer when I was 16 years old, my father couldn't afford a headstone for her grave for almost 2 years. He visited her burial site every Sunday anyway, placing flowers on the unmarked ground and talking to her as if she could hear every word. When he himself died 19 years ago, my sister Helen and I had to scrape together money from our own savings just to give him a proper burial. I opened that envelope as carefully as if it were made of ancient parchment that might crumble at the slightest pressure. Inside, I found a handwritten note on a single sheet of paper and a bank card that looked older than some of the furniture in this motel room. The card was worn almost beyond recognition. The numbers on the front had faded to the point where I could barely make them out even holding it directly under the lamp. The magnetic strip on the back had a visible scratch running through it that made me doubt it would even work in a modern card reader. I unfolded the note with trembling fingers and read my father's words through tears that had already begun to fall. "My dearest Eleanor," the note began, "keep this safe. Hide it well. Use it only when you truly need it, when there's nowhere else to turn. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more while I was alive. I hope you'll understand someday. I love you more than you will ever know. Dad." I sat on that motel room floor and wept in a way I hadn't wept since the day we buried him. I cried for my father, who had died without ever telling me about this card or what it might contain. I cried for myself, for the woman who had forgotten she even had this envelope tucked away in an old coat for nearly 2 decades. And I cried for the desperate, fragile hope that was beginning to form in my chest. The hope that maybe there might be enough money on this ancient card to buy me another week of survival in this terrible motel. I figured there might be $50 on it if I was lucky. Maybe $100 if my father had managed to save something over the years without anyone knowing. Enough for food. Enough for a few more nights in this room with the water-stained ceiling and the dripping faucet. Enough to buy myself a little more time to figure out what came next in a life that had completely fallen apart. I placed the card carefully on the nightstand and lay back on the bed with my father's note still clutched against my heart, and for the first time since Gerald had thrown me out, I slept. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in days. I showered, put on the cleanest clothes I had left, and walked to Westfield National Bank, the financial institution whose name was printed in faded letters on my father's ancient card. The building was old and impressive, with marble columns and brass fixtures that spoke of a different era of banking, a time when institutions like this were built to inspire confidence and trust. I almost turned around 3 times before I finally pushed through the heavy front doors. I felt out of place in my wrinkled clothes and unwashed hair, surrounded by people in business suits carrying briefcases and leather portfolios. But I was hungry, and I was desperate, and I had nowhere else to turn. I had no idea, as I approached the counter and handed that worn card to the bank manager, that my entire life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. Westfield National Bank stood before me like a monument to everything I no longer had access to in my life. The marble columns reached toward the sky, the brass doors gleamed in the morning sun, and through the windows I could see well-dressed people conducting business in the kind of hushed atmosphere that made you automatically lower your voice. I stood outside those doors for several minutes, looking down at my wrinkled jeans that hadn't been washed in 3 days, and the faded blouse I had been wearing since I left the motel that morning. My hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail because I didn't have the energy or the tools to make it look presentable. I hadn't slept properly in almost a week, and I knew the exhaustion showed on my face like a roadmap of my failures. But I was hungry, so desperately hungry that my hands were shaking and my head was pounding with the kind of ache that comes from not eating enough for too many days in a row. I pushed through those heavy brass doors and entered a world that no longer welcomed people like me. The marble lobby was filled with men wearing expensive watches and women carrying designer purses that probably cost more than my father had made in a year. I stood in line behind them, clutching that ancient bank card like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. When it was finally my turn at the counter, I approached with an apology already forming on my lips. I handed the worn card to the bank manager, a distinguished-looking man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and told him I was sorry to bother him with something so old. I explained that my father had given it to me a long time ago, and I just needed to see if there was anything on it. Even a few dollars would help. The manager, whose name tag read Theodore Wright, took the card with a professional smile and told me there was no need to apologize. He swiped the card through his reader, then typed something on his computer when the first swipe didn't work. He tried again, waited for the screen to load, and that's when everything changed. I watched his face transform from professional courtesy to something I had never seen before on another human being. The color drained from his skin like water running out of a bathtub. His fingers froze above the keyboard. His eyes widened behind his glasses to the point where I could see white all around his irises. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with shaking hands, put them back on, and stared at the screen again as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His mouth opened, but no sound came out for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a teenage boy going through puberty. He asked me to come with him immediately, to please not ask questions, just to come with him right away. The security guards appeared so quickly, I wondered if they had been waiting nearby the entire time. Everyone in the bank turned to stare at me as Mr. Wright lifted the partition separating customers from employees and practically pulled me through. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment as we walked down a hallway toward a private office, the security guards following close behind like I was some kind of criminal they were escorting to interrogation. I was absolutely certain that something terrible was about to happen. My mind raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. Had my father been involved in something illegal? Had he stolen money? Was this card connected to some crime I knew nothing about? Was I about to be arrested for something my father had done 19 years ago? By the time we reached the small but elegant office with its mahogany desk and leather chairs, I was shaking so badly I could barely walk. Mr. Wright guided me to a chair, and I gripped the armrests like they were the only things keeping me from floating away. He sat across from me and began typing rapidly on his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with an urgency that made my stomach twist into knots. I whispered that I didn't understand what was happening, that if my father had done something wrong, I swore I didn't know about it. Mr. Wright held up his hand to stop my panicked rambling and asked for my full name. When I told him I was Eleanor Morrow, he asked to see my driver's license. My hands shook so badly I could barely open my wallet. He compared my license to information on his screen, then began asking me questions. My date of birth, my mother's maiden name, which was Patterson, my father's full name, Henry Arthur Morrow, where I was born, which was Riverside General Hospital, the name of my first pet, a tabby cat named Whiskers. After I answered all his questions in a voice barely above a whisper, Mr. Wright leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses again. He rubbed his eyes like a man who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. When he looked at me again, his expression had changed from shock to something closer to awe, like he was looking at someone who had just won the lottery without buying a ticket. He told me he had been working at this bank for 34 years and had never seen anything quite like this. When I said I didn't understand, he asked if my father had ever discussed his finances with me, if he had ever mentioned an inheritance or an investment or a significant amount of money. The question seemed so absurd, I almost laughed. I reminded him that my father had been a building superintendent who fixed clogged drains and replaced broken window locks. He didn't have finances to discuss. He barely had enough money to buy groceries. Mr. Wright nodded slowly, then turned his computer screen toward me and told me to look at it very carefully. I leaned forward toward the computer screen, squinting at the numbers that seemed to swim before my eyes. Account information filled the top of the screen. Transaction history stretching back decades in neat columns, deposits, and interest accumulating year after year after year. But it was the number at the bottom that made my entire world tilt sideways. The balance. I counted the digits once, certain I was misreading them. Then I counted again, and a third time. My brain simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. $42,847,629.18. The room began to spin around me, and I gripped the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. One of the security guards took a half step forward, probably worried I was about to faint, which honestly wasn't far from the truth. I heard myself laughing, or maybe crying, the sounds mixing together in a way that bordered on hysteria. I told Mr. Wright this had to be a mistake, that he didn't understand who my father was. My father didn't have money. We were poor, genuinely poor, not the kind of poor where you complain about not affording luxuries, but the kind where you count pennies to buy milk. We ate canned soup 4 nights a week and day-old bread from the discount rack. My father patched his work boots with duct tape when the soles wore through because he couldn't afford new ones. He walked to work in the rain, in the snow, in 100-degree heat rather than pay for a bus ticket. This couldn't be real. Mr. Wright looked at me with gentle understanding and said my father had been a very careful man, more careful than anyone could have imagined. Over the next hour, he told me a story that changed everything I thought I knew about Henry Arthur Morrow, the man who had raised me in a tiny apartment and died with barely enough money for a funeral. 29 years ago, my father had inherited a piece of land from a distant uncle I had never even heard of, an uncle who had passed away without any other heirs. The land was in an industrial area on the edge of the city, the kind of place filled with abandoned warehouses and empty lots where nobody wanted to build anything. At the time, it was worth almost nothing, just a forgotten piece of property in a forgotten part of town. But a developer had approached my father with big plans for that area. They wanted to buy the land for a project they were planning, something ambitious that would require that specific plot as its cornerstone. They offered my father $300,000 cash, more money than he had ever seen in his entire life, enough to change everything for our family overnight. But my father didn't take the cash payment. Instead, he did something that nobody expected from a building superintendent who fixed toilets for a living. He negotiated a contract that would give him 7% of all future profits from anything built on that land, in perpetuity, forever, for as long as the building stood. The developer agreed immediately, probably laughing at this working-class man who was giving up guaranteed money for a percentage of profits that might never materialize. They thought he was a fool. They thought the percentage would amount to almost nothing, maybe a few $1,000s here and there over the years, maybe a few $100,000 if they were really successful. They were catastrophically wrong about everything. The developer built the Riverside Complex on my father's former land, and everyone in the city knew the Riverside Complex. 40 stories of luxury apartments where units sold for millions. 3 towers of premium office space housing Fortune 500 companies. A shopping center filled with stores I could never afford to shop in. A 5-star hotel where rooms cost more per night than my father made in a week. For 29 years, 7% of every rent payment, every lease, every purchase, every transaction that happened in that complex had been flowing into a trust account my father had set up. An account that was structured to transfer to me on my 30th birthday, but I had never received any notification. Mr. Wright explained with obvious discomfort that the bank had sent notification letters when I turned 30, but they had gone to my father's old address, the apartment where he had died 11 years earlier. By then, I had moved. I was married to Gerald, living in a different state entirely. The letters were returned as undeliverable, and through what he called administrative oversights, nobody had followed up. The account had simply sat there for 29 years, accumulating money, accumulating interest, growing larger and larger while I lived my life completely unaware that I was technically wealthier than most of the people I had served dinner to at Gerald's business parties. I sat in that leather chair, unable to speak, unable to think clearly, tears streaming down my face in rivers I couldn't control. The numbers on that computer screen kept rearranging themselves in my mind, refusing to solidify into reality. $42 million. All those years of poverty, genuine poverty, watching my father count pennies at the kitchen table to make sure we had enough for milk and bread. All those years of watching him patch his clothes with needle and thread because new shirts were a luxury we couldn't afford. All those years of him walking to work in boots held together with duct tape and determination. And the entire time, he had known this money existed. He had known it was accumulating, growing, becoming this impossible fortune, and he had never touched a single penny of it. When I asked why he would live like that, when he could have been comfortable, when he could have given us a better life, Mr. Wright's expression softened with something that looked like deep respect. He explained that the records showed my father had never touched this money, not once in 29 years. Every deposit went directly into the trust, and he had structured it with such specific legal protections that no one could access it except me. Not creditors if I ever fell into debt, not relatives who might come looking for handouts, and most importantly, not any spouse I might have. The trust was designed as an irrevocable inheritance account with me as the sole beneficiary, which meant under the law it could never be considered a marital asset. If I were ever married and then divorced, my spouse would have no legal claim to a single dollar. My father had been dead for 19 years, but somehow he had reached through time to protect me from a situation he couldn't have predicted, but had apparently feared might happen. He had created a safety net that no one could take away from me. Not a husband, not a lawyer, not anyone. I thought about my father sitting at his small kitchen table late at night, carefully reading legal documents by the light of a single lamp to save on electricity. Meeting with lawyers he must have paid with money he scraped together from who knows where. Walking home in the rain with his patched boots splashing through puddles, knowing he had millions accumulating in an account, but choosing poverty anyway. All so that someday, if I ever truly needed it, I would have something that was completely and untouchably mine. When I told Mr. Wright that my father had died without ever telling me about any of this, he gently reminded me of the note my father had left, suggesting I should only use the card when I truly needed it. Perhaps he had trusted that I would find it when the time was right. And the time, apparently, was now, when my world had gotten harder than my father could have imagined, but somehow had prepared for anyway. That's when Mr. Wright's expression changed again, becoming serious in a way that made my stomach drop. He pulled up another screen on his computer and told me there was something else I needed to know, something that concerned him greatly. The account had security flags on it. 4 months ago, someone had attempted to access information about accounts in my name. They had used my personal information, my social security number, my mother's maiden name, all the details someone would need to try to find hidden assets. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. 4 months ago was exactly when Gerald had started acting strangely. That was when he had hired what he called a business consultant, who I was never allowed to meet. When he started receiving thick envelopes with no return addresses. When he would close his laptop quickly whenever I walked into his office. When he and Patricia would whisper at dinner parties, both of them glancing at me with expressions I now understood weren't guilt, but calculation. The request to access my account information had been denied, and the account had been flagged for additional protection. But whoever had made that inquiry had clearly been looking for hidden assets in my name. When I told Mr. Wright that my husband had filed for divorce 3 months ago and had taken everything, leaving me with absolutely nothing, his expression hardened with understanding. The cruelty of Gerald's plan crystallized in my mind like ice forming on a window. He had found something, maybe a reference in an old document or a rumor from someone who worked at a bank decades ago. Maybe his private investigator had stumbled onto a trail that led to this account. He couldn't touch it legally because my father had made absolutely certain of that with his careful legal structuring. So Gerald had done the next best thing. He had destroyed me first. He had taken everything he legally could, left me homeless and penniless and desperate. And then he had waited for me to discover this money while I was broken and alone. Waited for me to feel guilty about hiding assets from our marriage. Waited for me to come crawling back, offering to share what he couldn't legally steal. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Gerald hadn't wanted a divorce. He had wanted to break me so completely that I would voluntarily give him what he couldn't take by force. Mr. Wright told me I needed to get a lawyer immediately, that if my ex-husband had been investigating my assets before the divorce was finalized, there could be serious legal implications. But I already knew exactly what I needed to do. For the first time since Gerald had thrown me out of my own home, I felt something other than despair and humiliation. I felt a cold, clear purpose forming in my mind, like a blade being sharpened. My father had protected me from beyond the grave. Now it was time to protect myself. Mr. Wright gave me the name of the best trust and estate lawyer in the city before I left the bank that day. James Thornton didn't just practice law. He waged war with legal documents and court filings like weapons. Within 2 days of our first meeting in his elegant high-rise office, he had assembled a complete picture of what Gerald had done, and it was even worse than I had imagined. The documents spread across his mahogany desk told a story of calculated betrayal that had started 6 months before Gerald ever mentioned the word divorce. He had hired a private investigator who had spent months accessing public records, tracing property transactions from decades ago, following paper trails that might lead to hidden assets. The investigator had attempted to access banking information using my personal details, my social security number, my mother's maiden name, everything Gerald knew about me after 22 years of marriage. He couldn't get into the actual account because my father's legal protections were bulletproof, but he had found enough breadcrumbs to know something valuable existed. Gerald had suspected there was money hidden somewhere, and that suspicion had driven every cruel decision that followed. He had rushed the divorce through before I could discover the truth. He had taken everything he legally could and left me with nothing, hoping desperation would drive me to find and share whatever assets he believed I was hiding. The trust my father had created was completely protected, Thornton assured me. Gerald had no legal claim to any of it, could never challenge the divorce settlement to access it, could never sue me for a penny of it. The money was mine completely, protected by legal structures my father had put in place almost 3 decades ago. But then Thornton's expression changed as he pulled out another set of documents, and what he showed me next made my blood run cold for entirely different reasons. Gerald and Patricia hadn't just betrayed me personally. They had been running a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate real estate development company. For 8 years, they had been buying properties cheap, doing minimal renovations with the cheapest possible materials, and selling them at massive markups while hiding defects that should have been disclosed to buyers. Foundation cracks covered with fresh concrete that would fail within months. Faulty electrical systems hidden behind new drywall that posed serious fire risks. Black mold painted over rather than properly remediated, leaving families breathing toxic air in their own homes. They had sold dozens of these dangerous properties to unsuspecting families who thought they were buying their dream homes. 2 months ago, their house of cards had started collapsing when a deck they had claimed was newly renovated gave way during a child's birthday party. A 7-year-old girl had been seriously injured, and the investigation that followed had uncovered pattern after pattern of fraud and negligence. The state was building a case against Gerald and Patricia that included charges of fraud, negligence, and reckless endangerment. Thornton leaned forward and told me that with my newfound resources, I could accelerate the investigation significantly. I could hire additional investigators to uncover more crimes. I could put pressure on regulatory agencies to move faster. I could pursue civil suits that would expose everything Gerald had done and destroy him financially within months. The invitation hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon waiting to be picked up. Part of me wanted to take it, wanted to watch Gerald lose everything piece by piece, the same way I had lost everything standing on that sidewalk with my single suitcase. But then I thought about my father, who had lived with millions in the bank, but still fixed toilets for elderly neighbors who couldn't afford a plumber. My father, who could have lived in luxury, but chose kindness over comfort every single day of his life. My father, who had given me more than money. He had given me an example of who I could choose to be. I told Thornton no, I wouldn't destroy Gerald. If he had committed crimes, the authorities would hold him accountable without my involvement. I wouldn't spend my father's gift on revenge. Gerald found me a month later at the modest apartment I had rented in a quiet neighborhood on the other side of the city. I don't know how he tracked me down, probably through the same private investigator he had used to search for my assets. But when I opened my door on a Tuesday evening, there he stood. He looked terrible in a way I had never seen him look in 22 years of marriage. His expensive suit was wrinkled like he had been sleeping in it. He hadn't shaved in days, and dark stubble covered his usually clean-shaven jaw. Dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older than when I had last seen him standing in the doorway of our former home with Patricia wrapped around him. The desperation in his expression was something entirely new. This wasn't the confident, controlling man who had thrown me out with $53. This was someone drowning and looking for anything to keep him afloat. I let him into my apartment not because he deserved it, but because I wanted to look him in the eye and see the truth of who he really was. He stood in my living room, his eyes scanning the comfortable furniture and fresh flowers, his jaw tightening as he realized I was no longer the desperate woman he had created. He accused me of hiding money from him throughout our entire marriage, but I told him the truth. I hadn't known about my father's trust until after he had thrown me out, and my father had made absolutely certain Gerald could never touch a penny of it. That's when his anger shifted to calculated pleading. He talked about our 22 years together, claimed the money should be family money, said we had built a life together. I reminded him that I had built his life while sacrificing my own, giving up my career and independence to support his dreams, only to be thrown away like yesterday's garbage when he decided he was done with me. He admitted Patricia was already planning to leave him, already talking to other investors, already looking for her next opportunity now that his money was running out. The investigation into his fraudulent business practices was destroying him. Investors were pulling out faster than rats abandoning a sinking ship. Banks were calling in loans he couldn't pay. He was going to lose everything, and he wanted me to use my resources to save him. He promised to pay me back, promised to do whatever I wanted, begged for help getting through this crisis he had created entirely on his own. I turned to face him with a calmness that seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. I reminded him of his own words the day he threw me out, how he had said we were even after 22 years, how he had given me until sundown to disappear from his life. I told him I knew about his investigation into my assets, how he had pushed the divorce through, quickly hoping to leave me desperate enough to share whatever he suspected I might have. When I told him I wasn't going to destroy him, even though I had the resources to do it, relief flickered in his eyes for just a moment. But I made it clear this wasn't mercy. My father had spent his entire life teaching me through his actions that kindness mattered more than revenge. The man who had walked to work in patched boots while sitting on millions had given me more than money. He had given me an example of how to handle power with grace. Whatever happened to Gerald next, the investigations, the lawsuits, the complete destruction of everything he had built through fraud and deception, that was the result of his own choices, not mine. I opened my door and told him goodbye, and this time I meant it. This was goodbye forever. He walked out with his shoulders slumped like a man heading to his own execution, and I closed the door behind him. The click of the lock sounded like the end of a book I never wanted to read again. Something lifted from my shoulders in that moment. Not triumph or satisfaction, just the simple relief of closure, the end of a chapter I had been dragging behind me for far too long. I didn't destroy Gerald. I didn't have to. His own choices caught up with him in ways I never could have orchestrated, even if I had wanted to. 6 months after I closed my door on him for the last time, the indictments came down like hammers falling. The state had built an airtight case against him and Patricia, documenting years of fraud, reckless endangerment, negligent construction practices, and falsified inspection reports. 17 families had been sold properties with hidden defects that put their lives at risk. 2 children had been seriously injured because of structural failures Gerald's company had covered up rather than fixed. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. News footage showed him being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, his expensive suit replaced with something cheaper, his confident posture replaced with the hunched shoulders of a man who knew he had lost everything. Patricia abandoned him the moment his bank accounts emptied, moving to Florida with a different real estate developer before Gerald's trial had even concluded. The mansion he had thrown me out of was sold to pay legal fees and settlements. The cars were repossessed. The business dissolved under the weight of lawsuits and criminal charges. Gerald pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lighter sentence, but he still received 3 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of probation. When I heard the news, sitting in my modest apartment with a cup of coffee and the morning paper, I felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction at his downfall, not pity for the life he had destroyed through his own greed and arrogance. Not triumph at being proven right about his character, just nothing. Gerald had become a complete stranger to me, someone from a life that no longer existed, someone I barely remembered caring about. And in that emptiness where anger and hurt used to live, I finally found what I had been searching for. I was free. With my father's gift came a responsibility I felt in my bones, a weight that wasn't burdensome but purposeful. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with this money, because I knew exactly what it felt like to have nothing, to stand on a sidewalk with $53 wondering if you would eat tomorrow. I created a foundation called Second Chances, with a purpose so simple it could be explained in a single sentence. We help women who have been left with nothing after divorce. Emergency housing for those who have nowhere to go after being thrown out of homes they helped build. Job training for those who sacrificed their careers to support husbands who later discarded them. Legal assistance for those fighting for what they deserve against men with expensive lawyers and deeper pockets. The kind of help I had desperately needed when I stood on that sidewalk with a single suitcase containing everything I owned in the world. In the first 2 years, we helped over 150 women rebuild their lives from the ground up. Women who had been told they were worthless by men who had promised to love them forever. Women who had been left with nothing but debt and shame and the wreckage of marriages they had tried to save. Women who had been exactly where I was, standing at the absolute bottom, wondering if there was any way back up. Every time I sat with a new woman at our foundation, listening to her story, holding her hand while she cried. I saw myself reflected back. When they thanked me with tears in their eyes, telling me they thought their lives were over, I told them the truth. I knew exactly how that felt. But they weren't alone anymore, and they were going to be okay. Watching them transform from broken to whole again gave me something I hadn't expected to find. It gave me purpose deeper than any purpose I had found in 22 years of marriage. I also created a scholarship in my father's name, something that would honor the man he truly was, rather than the poverty everyone had seen on the surface. The Henry Arthur Morrow Memorial Scholarship was designed for students whose parents work with their hands and their hearts, janitors like my father had been, maintenance workers and plumbers and custodians, the people who keep the world running smoothly but rarely get recognized or celebrated for their contributions. At the first scholarship ceremony, standing at a podium in a community college auditorium filled with proud families, I told them about my father, how he had spent his life fixing things for other people, fixing heaters when they broke in the middle of winter, fixing plumbing when it leaked and threatened to flood apartments, fixing lives in small ways that no one ever noticed or celebrated. He had lived in a tiny apartment and worn the same clothes until they literally fell apart, but he was the richest man I ever knew. Not because of the money he had hidden away, but because of how he treated people when no one was watching. The first scholarship went to a young woman named Maria, whose father worked as a hospital janitor. He had taken the night shift, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, for 18 years so he could be home when his daughter left for school each day. When I handed Maria her scholarship certificate and looked into her eyes, I saw something that took my breath away. I saw hope, pure and undiluted, the kind of hope that believes the future can be different from the past. It was the same hope my father must have seen in me all those years ago when he made the decision to protect a gift I wouldn't discover for decades. Maria hugged her father in front of that entire auditorium, both of them crying. And I understood in that moment why my father had lived the way he did. He had been planting seeds he would never see grow, building futures he would never witness, giving gifts that would multiply long after he was gone. On the 1-year anniversary of finding my father's bank card, I drove to the cemetery for the first time in over a decade. I hadn't been there in years, not since Gerald had started complaining that the drive was too long and the visits were depressing, as if honoring the dead was an inconvenience rather than a privilege. But Gerald was gone from my life now, completely and permanently, and I had something important to say to the man who had saved me from beyond the grave. The cemetery was peaceful on that autumn afternoon, with golden leaves falling from trees like nature's confetti, and the late afternoon sun casting everything in warm amber light. I walked along the path carrying yellow roses, my father's favorite flowers, the ones he used to buy for my mother on their anniversary, even when money was impossibly tight. His headstone was simple, exactly as he would have wanted it. Henry Arthur Morrow, beloved father, with just the years of his birth and death carved into gray granite. No flowery language about his accomplishments or his character, just his name and the dates that bookended a life most people would have considered unremarkable. I knelt beside the grave and placed the yellow roses against the stone, my fingers tracing the letters of his name like I was touching him one more time. I told him I was sorry it had taken me so long to come back. Sorry I had let Gerald's complaints keep me away from honoring the man who deserved honoring more than anyone I had ever known. I told him I had found his card and his gift exactly when I needed it most, just like his note had promised I would when the world got hard enough. I admitted I had been angry at him for a while after discovering the truth. I couldn't understand why he had lived the way he did when he could have been comfortable, why he had patched his boots with duct tape when he could have bought new ones, why he had walked in the rain when he could have taken taxis or bought a car. But sitting there beside his grave with the sun warm on my face and the wind rustling through the trees, I finally understood what he had been teaching me every single day of his life. Money doesn't define who you are. Kindness matters more than comfort. The richest person in any room isn't the one with the biggest bank account. It's the one who knows how to use what they have to help others. I showed him a photograph of Maria at her scholarship ceremony, her father's arm around her shoulders, both of them crying tears of joy and gratitude. I told him she reminded me of us, that her father reminded me of him, working night shifts so his daughter could have opportunities he never had. I told my father about the women I was helping through the foundation, women who had been left with nothing just like I had been, about the families living in affordable housing because I bought apartment buildings and kept the rents low instead of maximizing profit, about the students receiving scholarships in his name, students whose parents work with their hands and their hearts, just like he did for 31 years. I told him he had given me more than money. He had given me freedom, real freedom, the freedom to choose who I wanted to be instead of having that choice made for me by circumstances or by cruel men. And standing there beside his grave, I told him that I chose to be like him. I placed my hand on top of his headstone as if I were touching his shoulder one last time, and I promised him I would never waste what he had given me, not the money and not the lessons. I walked back to my car that day, feeling lighter than I had felt in years, maybe lighter than I had ever felt in my entire adult life. My father had hidden millions from the world, and from me, for nearly 3 decades. He had worn patched boots and walked in the rain and fixed other people's problems while quietly building something that would eventually fix mine. Not because he didn't love me enough to share it sooner, but because he loved me enough to let me grow first, to let me become strong enough to handle power with grace instead of greed. Some gifts aren't about money at all. They're about timing and trust, and believing that the person you love will eventually become the person they're meant to be. My father believed in me before I believed in myself, and that faith has become the foundation of everything I do now. Every woman I help through second chances, every family I house in affordable apartments, every student I send to college with a scholarship in my father's name, they're all part of his legacy continuing to grow long after his death. Gerald took everything from me that he could legally take, but he couldn't touch what my father had protected with such careful planning, and more importantly, he couldn't take who I became because of the trials I endured and the gift I discovered. If you're watching this and you're going through your own hard time, if someone has tried to break you, or if you feel like you have nothing left, I want you to know something important. The world has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Help comes from unexpected places, sometimes from people who have been gone for years, but whose love still reaches through time to save us. My father couldn't be here to see what I've become, but somehow I know he knows, and I hope with everything in me that I'm making him proud. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Share a moment when someone's secret gift or sacrifice changed your life, or tell us about a time when something unexpected helped you through an impossibly hard season. We read every single comment because your stories matter just as much as mine. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do so now and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we never expected to hear, the ones that remind us that kindness and sacrifice still exist in a world that often feels too cruel to bear. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to my story. And thank you for being part of this community where we celebrate the quiet heroes who change lives without ever seeking recognition. Until next time, remember that the people who loved you most might still be protecting you in ways you can't yet see, and the hardest moments of your life might be preparing you for the greatest gifts you'll ever receive.